I'm honored and humbled to be here. Humbled because there's so many leaders here who have put in so many years in this issue, and I'm coming from the agriculture side. But I guess I'm reassured by the fact that we're all still beginners at this task of solving complex problems, really complex, really stuck problems. I'm going to share just a little bit from the world of agriculture and a little bit of what I see as the challenges and frontiers ahead. My own history, I come, my grandfather was a farmer. I was a 60s activist and was a commercial dairy farmer for 15 years. And I was a member during that time dairy farming in Kentucky. In fact, I was a member of the board of directors of our local farm bureau, which was this sort of conservative mainstream organization. We passed, during the 80s when there was a farm crisis, we passed progressive resolutions in our local chapter, but they always disappeared when they got to the state convention. So I decided we needed to organize an alternative farm organization. And when Barack Obama was learning to be a community organizer in Chicago, I was learning to be a community organizer in rural Kentucky, and did create an alternative organization and was involved in national campaigns and around the Farm Bill, and always carried with me a bit of an anti-business bias. I think that characterizes the majority of NGO and activist people around the world, a kind of an assumption that business is primarily part of the driver of the problems, and maybe the business does a few good things, but it's not really the core of the solution. In fact, they need to be regulated. After a few years of work with business and in the business NGO government partnership arena, I now feel more hopeful than I ever used to feel. I feel a little bit more challenged by the problems we face. They keep getting bigger. But oddly and paradoxically, I feel more hopeful about solving them than I ever have before. I think there's a certain activist mentality that I used to carry and that many people do of sort of fighting the good fight. And a bit of a feeling of despair in the pit of one's stomach that it's probably not enough, but by God, I'm going to keep on fighting anyway. And I think that feeling of despair is a feeling of being marginal. And I think it's possible to imagine ourselves as pioneering, as creating a global combination of players, forces, innovations, creativity that's actually capable of solving these problems. I wound my way through various career paths, as one does by the time you get old like me, and joined Donella Meadows about 10 years ago in an institute that she created in Vermont. Donella Meadows was the principal author of Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome report that was a pioneering effort to apply system modeling to global environmental problems. And Dana's mantra was, blame the system, not the players, which I thought was profound, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. I sensed it was profound, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. And she, one of the first projects that she hired people to do, she taught at Dartmouth College, but she also created this NGO, and she hired people to do simulation models of forestry, fishing, and agriculture with the question, what is responsible for driving these communities of fishermen, communities of farmers, communities of loggers and sawmills and so forth, consistently towards both environmental and social stress? Why is that? That's how a good part of the wealth of our societies comes from these communities, and these communities are consistently driven to environmental and social stress. And it was a complicated project, so there's not much time now, but one of the insights from that project is one that's familiar to every fisherman and every farmer. It's that individual rationality doesn't line up with what we all want. So it's individually rational. For me, as a farmer in Kentucky, I was a dairy farmer, to produce more, whenever the price is low or I needed to make more money, to produce more for less. And in fact, to value my neighbor's farm more than my neighbor. And I did, in fact, go through an expansion phase and bought my neighbor's farm. So it's individually rational, of course, to increase catch, bigger boat, more boats. It's individually rational for a sawmill operator to invest in technology to take a narrower kerf out of a log, the blade, and produce more boards out of a log. But once you invest in that technology, of course, it's expensive, so you need to increase the throughput of logs through your mill. So it's individually rational, but collectively what happens, of course, we run out of fish, we run out of trees, we push the fertility of the soil. In agriculture, we always overproduce markets and drive down the price. So what's individually rational is creating these collective problems that nobody intends. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning intending to exploit poor people, drive them further into poverty so I make more money. Nobody does that. No farmer wakes up or fertilizer salesman wakes up and says, I think I'm going to go to work today and increase the size of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody does that, and yet that's the collective result of the structure of the system, the incentives, the rules, and our mental models of what success looks like. Success for a farmer, for me, was to be big enough and progressive enough to be featured on the cover of the farm magazine, right? And that means a certain sort of definition of success. So the Sustainable Food Lab, which I managed, which we founded as a leadership project about 7 years ago, was founded by a group of people who were all engaged in sustainability, all had track records of success, and all were a little bit frustrated about not doing enough to solve the bigger problems. One of the early conversations involved some colleagues at the Kellogg Foundation who said, we invest in community projects, we have local food marketing projects, and we take our board of trustees out to meet with small farmers and meet with urban poor who now get access to food, and we all feel proud and go home satisfied. And yet we look at the larger trends, the number of farmers, the fertility of the soil, water, and so forth, and they're going in the wrong direction. So we wonder whether we're putting our money in the right places, and we need more thinking partners who see the world differently than we do. Colleagues from Unilever said, we know how to do sustainability when we know the farmers, and we can work with the local universities and figure out the best practices. We don't know how to source sustainably when we're sourcing out of global commodity markets, soy, palm oil, and so forth, in which we're in a race to the bottom. Despite our nice sustainable agriculture brochures, our commodity buyers are buying on price. And everybody's chasing yields at low price. And so that's driving a race to the bottom. What do? We need more players. So I at the same time met some people clustered around Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, and some others around the MIT circles who were designing ways for stakeholders from different parts of a system to solve really tough, difficult, complex, stuck problems. And it's been written up. Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, wrote a book recently called The Necessary Revolution. Another guy, Otto Scharmer at MIT, wrote a book called Theory U. At any rate, the theory goes you need a group that's both diverse and influential. Diverse meaning seeing different parts of the system, influential meaning being able to act and make a difference. Take that group through a process. We took our founding group of the Food Lab through a process where we kind of got all the data on the table from different angles, different perspectives, and started imagining the sorts of solutions. We never created a shared vision. I actually don't believe in multi-stakeholder groups coming together and first creating a shared vision. It's always lowest common denominator and boring. But I do believe that you can take a group of people that don't necessarily agree with each other and find very productive things to do together. So that was our purpose. Not to create consensus, but to do things. And we also went by a certain set of assumptions that creativity, innovation in social change was going to be anchored in relationship. Relationship among unusual partners. We took people in rural Brazil. We actually kind of snookered everybody into a meditation retreat in the mountains of Arizona, where everybody was camping on the mountains and kind of meditating on the purpose of their life, which was profoundly moving for all of us, but it also created relationships that were quite unusual. And then we entered into the action phase with a spirit of prototyping. I think social change could learn a little bit from product development, in which the mantra is fail early and fail often. So try things out early, try things out conceptually before you invest a lot of money in them. Strategic planning can take you forever, and by the time it's done, it goes on a shelf, right? The act of strategic planning is useful. Strategic plans are usually not, in my judgment. At any rate, one of the tools we used, and I think it's an upgrade on the normal sort of field visit or study tour or trips you might take to the harbor and the boats and so forth. And we call them learning journeys. And we get people in small mixed groups, where we get people from business and government and farmer cooperatives and so forth. And we visit very different aspects of the system. In our case, smallholders, really poor people, managers, labor organizers, environmental activists, so forth. So that's not so unusual. But what we do that just requires a little bit of effort but makes a huge difference is we add in reflection and listening. So it sounds duh, but actually I think none of us much are trained to listen. We're trained to speak. And what we before we go on a set of visits, we get everybody we tell them what the agenda is for the day, who we're going to go visit, and get everybody to we hand out journals, and people write down their assumptions about what they're going to go see. We're going to go see some labor organizers. Well, I know what that's all about. A bunch of commies or something like that. So after each visit, before people start chit-chatting and getting back on the van, we get them to sit in a circle and look at their journals and write down to themselves what they noticed, what they're curious about, what surprised them, and then share that. One guy who went on one of these with me is executive VP of one of the largest companies in the United States, and he said, Hal, I'm amazed that 12 of us can go to the same thing and see 12 different things, have 12 different conversations. He was not only noticing that the perspectives of other people on the van were different than his, but he was noticing his own lens by which he sees the world. And I think that's actually the most powerful piece of all, is to notice one's own assumptions. And then you can kind of open up and listen to the assumptions of others and learn to see things from different angles. Sometimes in meetings I say, I think that business leaders of the future will be most successful if they also know how to see the world through the eyes of NGOs and through the eyes of government. And likewise, people that lead NGOs are going to be most successful if they can learn to see the world through the eyes of business and through the eyes of government. And one of these learning journeys we went on, we took a mixed group to Honduras. They were mostly visiting projects where Oxfam was working with very poor people. Two of the corporations represented were Unilever and Cisco. The guy from Unilever, well, there are a couple people, but the guy from Unilever, who's now the manager of sustainable sourcing there, he told me a few years ago, he said, it's about 5 years ago, he said, Unilever doesn't consider smallholders and poverty to be part of our sustainability agenda. And that was fairly common. Now Unilever just made a commitment to include 500,000 more poor people in their supply chain. Unilever's also recently released a sustainable living plan in which they made very quantifiable commitments to which they can be held responsible for greenhouse gas reductions and water efficiency and so forth. Cisco was also on that trip, and they've got a project with Oxfam in Guatemala in the highlands, working with Mayan farmers, supporting those farmers to access markets, local markets, regional markets, global markets, and most of the production will be local, which is appropriate. But because Cisco made that commitment, that group can now access European Commission money and UN agency money to invest in packing sheds and irrigation and that sort of thing. Germinated partnerships that are quite unusual, and for Cisco, this is a Republican Houston Republican company. This is not a Dutch responsible Unilever. So I think just a couple of comments about the big trends. These things are very promising. The World Economic Forum in Davos last week made their, I think, 17 multinational corporations in the food space made some very impressive commitments to a vision of reduced environmental footprint and improved performance on social indicators, on poverty and well-being of smallholders. But we all know that we're still overshooting limits. We're still, there are more people desperately poor now than there were 5 years ago. So it's clear that even though the private sector is shifting and these partnerships are emerging, it's not enough fast enough. The countervailing pressures are huge, short-term numbers for business especially. There's an article recently that's worth looking at. The most recent-ish edition of the Harvard Business Review has an article by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer called Fixing Capitalism. And Michael Porter is one of the preeminent business strategists from business schools. And they argue that we're shifting from an age of corporate social responsibility to what they called shared value. Corporate social responsibility frequently being sort of bolted on at the edge of a company. In the beginning, to create a kind of a responsible gloss. And, there's nothing wrong with that. That's where it starts. But Porter and Kramer, and I think they're right, are arguing that successful businesses for the long haul will have sustainability more baked into the core rather than bolted onto the edge. And Porter and Kramer have three different elements of this transition. One is a sort of re-understanding products and markets, sort of embedding responsibility in the branding of products. Two is redefining productivity, so developing metrics not only for kind of productivity per cost unit, but also for things like carbon and water and energy, biodiversity, and having quantifiable targets for those things too. In the end, it means getting the prices right so that these so-called externalities become internal. And three is investing in clusters of economic activity where you do business. That's a little bit of a reversal, that concept, a little bit of a reversal of globalization, in which we've kind of separated economic activity from place. They're arguing that responsibility now means kind of embedding responsibility to place in your business strategy. I'd add two pieces to that. Those elements of kind of, we might say, new business models. Again, redefine products, redefine productivity, and invest in place. A lot of these problems won't be solved by business without partnerships with NGOs and ultimately partnerships with government. I keep mentioning government, but I will say that in our experience at the Sustainable Food Lab, we had an aspiration of shared activity between all three sectors. And for the most part, government's been absent from everything we've done. And I think that for us is on the frontier of figuring out. Government is hard to, well, at any rate, I won't go into that. So hybrid structures around particular problems may be delimited in time and focus. NGOs and multi-stakeholder things sometimes take on a life of their own and they become things for themselves rather than things for the mission. Maybe very tightly defined mission focused partnerships to solve complicated problems. Deforestation in Indonesia, for example. I mean, big, tough problems, but business can't solve that by itself, despite the moratoria that the buyers of palm oil announce and so forth. We can't solve it in an atmosphere of failed government and no regulation and so forth. And finally, I think the thing that I see the most need for, or a big need for, is a kind of a global cadre of entrepreneurial conveners, of creative, multi-stakeholder, solution-focused activities. Peter Senge, in his book Necessary Revolution, calls these people system leaders. And many of his examples exist within business, but in a lot of ways operate as sort of hybrid NGO business leaders who do see the world through each other's eyes and do develop the capacities of bringing the best of the public good focus of NGOs and the entrepreneurial get it done, be realistic and practical focus of business. So that's what I have to share. I salute you. You are leaders of one of the most globally important movements or sets of activities on the face of the earth, and I'm proud to be with you during the last few days.